the radical change in the GOP since the rise of Trump, it really is quite extraordinary. It's like really a different party. What the hell happened? Where did this come from? Well, hello out there in podcast land. Welcome to a new edition of the Liberal Patriot podcast. I'm your host, Rudy Giuliani. And at this podcast, we endeavor to give you the very finest in heterodox conversation and analysis with the most interesting and provocative guests. And so today, I'm very pleased to have Jonah Goldberg, my colleague at AEI. And let me tell you a little bit about Jonah. He's the Asness Chair in Applied Liberty at AEI, where he's also a senior fellow. He's co-founder and editor-in-chief of The Dispatch. He's host of the podcast The Remnant with Jonah Goldberg. And he's a weekly columnist for the LA Times. And I could go on and on and on, but I won't. But, suffice it to say, he's out there. He's, he's an author and personality, and the kind of guy that he's sort of like in the elite sphere of pundits. He's like an A-level pundit. So we're going to have some A-level punditry here today. But I thought, Jonah, obviously people think, it's the election. They'll expect us to talk about the election, and we will. We'll get to that. But I thought first we go more big picture, since everybody's sort of in the weeds with the latest polls and all that. And I was very interested to read this long exchange you had with Damon Linker on his Substack about basically about populism and the lay of the land in that respect. So, let's do big picture then. Why Trumpism? It is remarkable. I think we're so used to it at this point, but the radical change in the GOP since the rise of Trump, it really is quite extraordinary. It's like really a different party. I don't have to tell you that as a lifelong conservative. So what the hell happened? Where did this come from?
Yeah, so let me back up and just first say I'm a huge fan of the Liberal Patriot. I got my start in Washington working for Ben Wattenberg, who I had all sorts of interesting experiences and disagreements with Ben, but he was on the side of the angels as far as I could understand about a similar project. Not the same entirely, but a similar project in the 70s and 80s, trying to keep the Democratic Party from spiraling out, letting the damn hippies run everything. And so I've always had a sort of, between that and my investment in the true history of neoconservatism, which was as much a left of center phenomenon in many ways as a right of center phenomenon. I really find the space that you guys are in great and interesting, and I think you guys do great work. All right,
Thank you, sir.
Well, where to begin? You're the highfalutin political scientist here, but the phrase an overdetermined phenomenon, right? So
yes. In fact, I love to see that in your exchange with Linker, because it takes me back to my grad school days when Louis Althusser, the structuralist Marxist eminence grise of the French school, always was talking about things being overdetermined, and no one was really 100% sure what he meant by that. But we thought it was all very, very wise and very profound, and it kind of is, because hey, things are complicated, man. So yeah. Go ahead.
And I'm just sort of grateful that I finally know how to pronounce that guy's name, because I've read it for a gazillion years, but I've never said it out loud, and I'm not going to try now. But
well, this is a podcast, Jonah, where things like Louis Althusser do come up and get the attention they so richly deserve.
In my head, it was always like Althusser or something, because you just you get these things and you just keep going. But
common mistake.
That makes more sense.
Can you pronounce Poulancis?
I cannot, and I am sure no one has ever mispronounced Roy Teixeira before. So,
Never happens. Never happens.
Yeah, so all I mean by an overdetermined phenomenon is that there were too many things pointing in the same direction, too many variables that were mitigating or militating towards this outcome to tease out just one and say it would happen because of this, right? Sort of like, why are Jews liberal? I can give you 10 different reasons, and some of them are 100% true for some people and 0% true for other people, but in the aggregate. And so I think part of it was the GOP in some ways stumbled into the language of populism as a way to peel off parts of the FDR coalition going back to, Nixon and the hard hat guys, right?
Sure.
I mean, that kind of thing. And over time, the irony is that I don't think historically, if you go back 100 plus years, the GOP actually is historically a populist party. The Democratic Party is a populist party. It's the party, FDR was in many ways a populist, Huey Long, all that kind of stuff. But because it was a populist party, the Democratic Party had more internal muscle memory and mechanisms about how to deal with populism when it gets out of hand, right? I mean, the superdelegates are just one example of a long history of the party actually being more of a party and knowing how to deal with the problem of riding a tiger. The GOP had no muscle memory of populism, and it thought it was just harmless to indulge this bullshit ad infinitum without ever thinking that this could go wrong. And then you add in Fox News, which
could go wrong, right? Yeah.
Fox News, which has always been, and I was writing this 20 years ago. I was writing this when I was a Fox News contributor. Fox News was always more populist than it was conservative. And the genius of Fox News was, among other things, to marry what I call bridge and tunnel populism, which is sort of Donald Trump's populism, populism of the New York Post, which is always worried about, angel tots who've been killed by, monster thugs and all this kind of stuff and all that kind of thing. And it managed to marry that form of populism with what I don't necessarily mean pejoratively as flyover country populism, rural Midwestern populism.
That's a very good point.
And it found a sweet spot for that. And it just kept indulging it, kept feeding the beast, kept indulging language that's saying our elites don't matter, that our elites are fools and idiots and all that kind of stuff, which is Donald Trump's core message. Donald Trump does not believe in American exceptionalism. And then you add in things like the disasters or perceived disasters of the Iraq War, of the financial crisis, and you know this stuff better than I do. Financial crises have long tails of populist upheaval. George W. Bush actually recently I saw this thing in Semaphore just I think yesterday. George W. Bush had a pretty good shorthand, explanation about how the financial bailouts fueled populism, and I think he's right about that. And so then you add in just broader things that I think are problems of the culture, rather than just specific to the Republican Party. We tend in this country to follow politics like a form of entertainment. When you follow things as a form of entertainment, all you want is your team to win. And you don't really care how they do it. They just you want the hero to get the MacGuffin. And I think in an era of increasing secularization, politics is mapping a lot like a secular religion these days, where it's becoming a form of identity politics. When you and I were kids, or young men even, if I asked you if you were a Republican or a Democrat, I'd have to ask you a follow-up question to find out if you were a conservative or a liberal. Now, those things map almost perfectly, at least rhetorically, maybe not in terms of policy and substance, but in terms of identification kind of thing. And that makes it very difficult to have serious conversations about interests and all that. And I could go on, but that's sort of the top line.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. That tribalization is really quite remarkable when you think about it in the context of how, we grew up and sort of our attitudes toward the parties. It wasn't like, God, I'm a Democrat. It's so great. I just want to kill those Republicans. It's like, I guess I'm kind of a Democrat, but, they're not so great either. And, there wasn't that sort of rooting partisan, flamboyant commitment to one party over the other, which really does define our politics. But let me push you a little bit on this, the origins, the rise of Trumpism as
Sure.
being kind of, they weren't ready for the populism. They just want to win. It's the fusion of urban and rural populism. But isn't there underneath it all, Jonah, kind of an economic component as well? I mean, especially when we look at the rise of right populism across countries, that basically a lot of this populist energy that flows into center-right parties like the Republicans, it comes out of areas of the country that really, and sort of social strata that really do feel like they've been left behind and really to some extent objectively have been left behind. Of course, that was all underscored by the great financial crisis. So, I mean, isn't part of it that center-right parties like the Republican Party have benefited from the rise of that discontent, but they don't really know how to process it because they're not a party that's set up for dealing with those kind of economic grievances. And that to the extent they had an economic program, it wasn't very interesting to those kinds of voters, right? I mean, the traditional sort of quasi-libertarian economics of the Reagan era just doesn't play that well with these voters. Don't you think that was a part of why the old consensus fell apart and Trumpism rose so quickly?
I definitely think it's part of it. I think that's fair, and you're right to point out that I gave the vulgar Marxist materialism that you're so wont to indulge. No, but I'm kidding. No, just the material, the economic factor is, I think, legitimate and real, and I think it really reached its apotheosis with Mitt Romney's campaign, where they ran as if everybody in the country wanted to be a tech entrepreneur or something, right? You know, and that whole makers and takers language,
right? Yeah,
was terrible.
It was the Ayn Rand peak of GOP rhetoric. It's pretty weird.
I think that was sort of a high watermark, and in two ways. One, I think on the substance, the economic policy that it conveyed was bad politics, but also that loss, in part because of places like Fox, which insisted that Romney was going to win. When Romney lost, the disappointment discredited that form of Republican politics in a lot of ways, right? Is how could you guys lose to Barack Obama? Never mind that Romney's share of the vote, I think, was higher than Trump's was in 2016.
Right.
He just lost because the electorate was different. And, you know, this sort of gets back to my bit about neocons. I have a warm spot in my heart for some of our colleagues. I wasn't part of them, and I made fun of them a little bit at the time, who Yuval Levin, Michael Strain, Ramesh Ponnuru, a bunch of those guys now 15 years ago, started a project called, that got shorthanded as the Reformicons, right?
Right, yeah, talk about that. I think that's a fascinating development that people don't think about anymore, but it's actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, well, I'm part of my grievance, and it's a serious intellectual grievance. I don't wake up in the morning kicking the cat because of it, but it's something that I think is lost in this really stupid time to be alive, is that the argument that Yuval and Ross Douthat, and you can go down a long list of people, they were making was the benefits that we got from the Reagan program. A lot of those were achieved, right? And so, like Ramesh would often point out that when you lower the marginal income tax rate from 69% or whatever it was to 34%, lowering it still from 34% to 28% is just not going to yield as much return as that first, as all that low-hanging fruit that you got. And maybe we should start looking at other things and looking at, like, the working classes who don't pay much or anything often in income taxes, but they pay a lot in payroll taxes. And maybe there are things that we could do there. And Michael Strain talked about how, the problem isn't that we don't have jobs in this country, is that we don't have jobs where people need them. So maybe what we could do is subsidize people to travel to where there are jobs, and come up with all sorts of things. And as Yuval used to put it, apply Reaganite principles to today's problems. The high priest types back then, which it's an interesting thing if you go back and look, it was both the Wall Street Journal editorial page and a lot of their writers and people like Mark Levin, right, who don't see eye to eye at all anymore. That world is really balkanized. But back then, there was a very serious cult of Ronald Reagan and I loved Ronald Reagan, don't get me wrong, but that said, no, you can't, not only can you have to use his principles, but you also have to use his actual policies from 1983 or something. And they beat down any sort of dissenting policy innovation, any attempt to sort of meet voters where their needs were today, to the point where you get the GOP losing these elections. And then some guy who comes along who has no friggin' clue about how to actually do the public policy to help these people just wins those voters based on their grievances rather than actually trying to help them. And I think there are that when a serious intellectual history of the last 20 years is written, there's going to be some harsh judgments for the people who stifled policy innovation on the right, which would have perhaps forestalled some of the desperation that you see Trump tapping into. I mean, an analog to it is on immigration, right? So at National Review, I was at National Review for 20 plus years. The standard line at National Review was that if responsible politicians don't deal with immigration, irresponsible politicians will pick up the issue and run wild with it. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, sounds familiar.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, like, it became, if you don't deal with these issues when they're ripe and possible to change, they fester and they get worse and more toxic. And I mean, immigration is a fantastic example of that. But you can think of all sorts of other issues where if the GOP had been more proactive and constructive when it had the flex to do it, you might not have seen the white working class in particular get as susceptible to the messages of a demagogue like Donald Trump, or frankly, a demagogue like Bernie Sanders. I mean, people forget how close we would be having a conversation about what the hell happened to the Democratic Party if Bernie Sanders had gotten the nomination in 2016, which was definitely possible.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So basically you're arguing that we should, if we want one aspect to the rise of Trumpism within the Republican Party, it should be seen through the prism of the failure of the Reformicons, right? That this was a small part of it. This was a movement that had, is asking some of the right questions about how the Republicans could adapt to changing circumstances. It never really took off. And as a result, partly as a result of that, you get something else arising in the party later that can take advantage of this, sort of try to deal with these changes in a much more toxic way and try to animate that working class base in a much more toxic way. And by God, it worked. But, sort of the initial attempt of Reformicons to address the problem was sort of a noble failure, though unfortunately a failure nonetheless.
When Sam's Club's Republicans came out?
That was Reihan Salam and Ross Douthat would talk about that, I guess. And also, wasn't there some Minnesota Republican governor? I forget his name.
But anyway. Pawlenty? Was it Pawlenty? No.
Yeah, Pawlenty.
Yeah.
Tim Pawlenty,
If that constructive effort of actually being engaged with public policy and had been allowed to blossom, I think you would have seen or could have seen something very different. The problem was that in response to Barack Obama, in part, you had to, for various structural, cultural reasons, let libertarian populism run its course first. And that's how you got the Tea Parties. Right. And I was very sympathetic to the Tea Parties. I don't like populism. I've never liked populism. But libertarian populism felt like that great libertarian prophecy of the people will rise up, take over the government, and leave everybody alone.
If you're stuck with populism, you'll take libertarian populism.
Exactly. I mean, it's the most harmless It's like pacifist militarism. It's like you can only do so much damage, but was not to be.
So, who's picking? I mean, interesting to think about the Reformicon approach in the context of where we are today and sort of the intellectual debates and the and sort of the Republican and conservative world. I mean, you have this debate now between national conservatives and freedom conservatives. You have the rise of Orrin Cass and his American Compass kind of wing of the Republican Party, which has a bunch of sympathetic senators. I mean, is this sort of a continuation of, is this in a way a synthesis of Reformiconism and Trumpism? I mean, what's going on there? I mean, it seems like I'm an outside observer to some extent. I'm not a, kind of conservative Republican or anything, but it seems like there's no unity really. I mean, there's just this roiling debate among how to deal with these working class and economic issues, right? And sort of deal with the base the Republican Party is now stuck with to some extent. Nobody's really sure exactly how to do it, but they're pretty sure they disagree with each other.
Yeah, so I want to be really clear about this. I do not think in any way, shape, or form the Reformicon stuff led to the new industrial policy, nationalist conservative stuff, right? I mean,
Okay.
what Yuval and Ramesh and Michael were trying to do was work within guidelines of free market policies that had a role for government, right? But at the same time was
Right.
not top-down bureaucratic kind of stuff.
Of course, Orrin Cass would say the same thing, would he not?
I don't know that he would.
Okay.
I think that I don't want to be unfair to a specific personality, right? I mean, Orrin Cass,
Right.
I think, is a smart guy. I don't like much of his project, but more broadly, I think the national conservative stuff basically stems from a concerted effort of intellectual and policy turd polishing to put some substance on
Go
Donald
on, say
Trump.
what you really think there, Jonah.
Well, no, look, I'm very serious about this. I mean, like
Right.
you can tell from the early debates, such as they were, of 2017, 2018, where the Tucker Carlson universe, when he was still at Fox, and all of these other people were talking about how libertarians had run Washington for the last 30 years. These people who like Elizabeth Warren's economic policies and all these kinds of things. A lot of these things are, there were a bunch of attempts at eggheady journals that were trying to do for Trumpism what, say, the New Republic was launched to do for TRism, right, is put policy heft around it. And the problem is that all of that failed in terms of actually trying to construct a consistent ideological framework for Trump, because Trump does not have one. But
Right.
at the
Yeah.
same
I mean,
time-
to be fair to them, I mean, it was. You could say that was a noble effort. It just, what are you going to do? You can't control Trump, and you can't control.
That's right.
The
Trump-
people around him.
Which is one of the reasons why, you're asking how we got here. I think that phenomenon is in microcosm and illuminates how you get cult of personality politics. Because what Trump does is contradicts himself constantly, right? I mean, for socialized medicine, not for socialized medicine, for abortion, against abortion, yada, yada, yada. You go down a huge, long list of things. And there are only a handful of things that he's consistent on, and mostly he's consistently wrong, like, massive tariffs and whatnot. And so when you try to construct an intellectual project to sort of say, here's what he's really doing, here's the goal, and yada, 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 and then he beclowns you, right? Like he says, like imagine being a sincere pro-lifer and trying to square the circle of Trump's positions in the last 2 months. You can go crazy.
Yeah, it definitely takes some mental gymnastics to do that.
I mean, it takes the kind of yoga skills that you can put your own cranium through your rectum. And so I think that what you get is you get this fallback position, which we've seen in plenty of senators, plenty of congressmen, plenty of people like the people at the Heritage Foundation, where what they do is they just simply say, look, I trust his judgment. I have faith in him, because that is the only thing that you can never, if you're going to remain in Trump world, it's the only thing that's non-falsifiable, right? You can't you can't get into trouble for it in Trump world by just saying, dear leader, he says we're going to have the greatest wheat harvest east of the Urals we've ever seen. I believe him. And if it turns out not to be true,
Right.
it's because the revolution was betrayed.
We will
right?
fulfill our 5-year plan. Absolutely,
Exactly.
comrade. Absolutely.
And so I think that the intellectual projects surrounding Trump, some of which I think are sincere, right? They all have their origins in that process of trying to figure out a way to put meat on the bones of Trumpism. And I think that's and some have decided, okay, we're going to just stick with this point of view. We think the dead consensus, the old zombie Reaganism, no longer works. And so for most of my life, I was a big opponent of horseshoe theory. I increasingly believe in horseshoe theory because the thing I always thought that made horseshoe theory unpersuasive was that the right I grew up in was surrounded by was dogmatically committed to things like original understanding of the Constitution and free markets. And the whole notion that the more
Right.
libertarian you get, the more fascist you get, I always thought was nonsense. But when one extreme embraces illiberalism and the other side embraces illiberalism, creating this space where you and I seem more similar, you being on the center left and me being on the center right, at the same time you get illiberal lefts and illiberal rights that really are just involved in contests of power, rather than contests of principle. And I think that America has an illiberalism problem. The right-wing flavor has its own flavor. The left-wing flavor has its own flavor. But the core problems with it are the problems with illiberalism, right? I mean, there's a right-wing cancel culture and there's a left-wing cancel culture.
Yes,
there's a right-wing anti-Semitism problem. There's a left-wing anti-Semitism problem. You can go down a very long list. And
yeah, it's disturbing.
And that's where we are. Anyway. So, where do you come down on this? Like, what, do you see Republicans? I mean, like, as someone who thinks should be a more robust role for the government and the economy, you should be welcoming some of these changes in the Republican Party. Are you, or do you think they're problematic?
Well, I mean, there are aspects of them that are problematic, but as a good social democrat, I'm happy to see more Republicans entertain the idea of a robust role for government, and that the free market, unleashing it, doesn't necessarily solve all problems. I mean, I'm definitely not, nor have I ever been, a libertarian in economic issues. That said, I mean, it does seem like, as I was saying earlier, it's all pretty unsettled what the actual policies that a Republican Party is attempting to promulgate over time really are. And it's all vexed by the influence of Trump and Trumpism. But I mean, I hold out some hope, I guess, that over time there'll be some synthesis within the Republican Party that will move it toward, a sort of conservative version of social democracy, I suppose. I mean, I think it's not out of the question. I mean, Henry Olson, who we both know, does seem to think some sort of synthesis, sort of a progressive conservatism is actually possible, and that the different free con and nat con wings of the party could eventually wind up in sort of a not exactly the same place, but be able to work with one another to provide an alternative to the Democrats that would be attractive to, a sort of the right kind of majority of voters. I mean, I'm just putting out a piece with actually Yuval on Politics Without Winners, where we basically argue that if you look over the history of party coalitions in the United States, it's a pretty unusual time where neither party seems to be making a serious effort to form a dominant majority, and we sort of toggle back and forth between different types of elections, which are all quite close. But if such a synthesis could take over the Republican Party, maybe it's possible they could move toward being that dominant majority. Right now, obviously, it doesn't look too promising. But I would think that, it shouldn't be ruled out that, there's a way in which the Republicans could mobilize and keep and maybe expand their working class base, the kind of multiracial populism Patrick Ruffini talks about, that would be twinned with an actual policy approach that would, garner that dominant majority and would actually, dare I say it, make people's lives better. But, I think we're still pretty far from that today. But obviously, again, as a good social democrat, I can only politely applaud the willingness to entertain some alternatives to the classic Reaganite economic policy. So I mean, that's it's a mixed bag from my perspective, like it's a mixed bag from your perspective, but we come at it from a little bit different directions, reflecting the fact you're on the center right, I'm on the center left, but
yeah.
So I don't know. So does that make any sense to you?
I mean, I think, look, I do think it is possible that there will be some sort of synthesis. I mean, and let's be fair to Ronald Reagan. I mean, Ronald Reagan talked a lot about free trade and small government, but when Harley Davidson needed saving, he saved Harley Davidson,
absolutely.
That kind of thing. And so
I agree.
There's always going to be room in actual electoral politics for ideological inconsistency and political pragmatism. And what I would hate to see is a Republican Party that loses that loses the rhetorical commitment to conservative principles, right, on economics and on other things. Insofar as, look, politicians will always disappoint you. That was one of the rules at National Review. That it was one of our mantras, and that's fine. But the moment one of my favorite definitions of rhetoric is from this guy, Wayne Booth, who said rhetoric is the art of probing what men believe we ought to believe. And okay. I think that for conservatives in the Anglo-American tradition, believing in limited government, believing in the free market, all other things being equal, is superior to rule of experts and whatnot, is where rhetorically you need at least one party to be.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I agree with that.
And if you have two parties that both believe that no, experts can run the economy, just our experts can do it and yours can't, then you get the dynamics of a race to the bottom, where everyone is out competing each other to write bigger checks to different populations, to pick different winners and different losers. I mean, this is my fundamental problem. You brought up Orrin Cass. This is my fundamental problem with that whole crowd, is that I grew up a Friedrich Hayek guy, right? And Friedrich Hayek, one of his greatest, insights is in his essay on the uses of knowledge in society, where he just talks about how experts cannot have access to the kind of information in real time required to run the economy better than markets can, right? And that's why some of your heroes in the New Deal murdered those 6 million baby pigs just to figure out how to get pork prices up, right? I mean,
oh, those poor baby pigs! I still shed a tear about that,
and never forget. And so, no, but my point is that we've been saying that forever. Everyone sort of believed it to one extent or another on the right, and not just libertarian right, but this was, basically when you talked about a conservative economist for most of my life, you meant libertarians. You meant Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell, and you go down a long list. Right. And now all of a sudden, in the blink of an eye, in part to do this sort of permission structure for Trump thing, you get a bunch of people saying, no, you don't understand. Yeah, the knowledge problem is real when progressive experts run everything. But our experts are smart enough to do things better. So you have Marco Rubio.
I'm not so sure that's fair to Orrin that's his.
Well, but it's certainly fair to Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio wrote a piece for the Washington Post where the headline of it was industrial policy. Why I'm for industrial policy, but done right. And it's like, oh,
well, come on.
We forgot to do it right. That's why it didn't work before.
America's always had an industrial policy. The second American system was industrial policy. The way the United States approached a lot of things after World War II was, in a way, an industrial policy. I mean, the government always has a role. Infrastructure development has a role. At one point in American economy, tariffs had an actually important and useful role. I mean, there's always...
I agree with you that there will always be a policy about industry in the country, and in that sense, you're right.
The government will have some role,
right? But we're talking here about the guy who literally ran for office for Senate at the height of the Tea Party thing. Who's, I think the New York Times Magazine described him as the senator from the Tea Party.
And right, he does seem to have changed a bit.
And now he used to be great about the problems with picking winners and losers and how government can't do this kind of stuff. And now, because the intellectual, such as it is, environment has changed, he seems to have discovered that if you do industrial policy right, it's fine. And I have an industrial policy that is not purely libertarian. I think on things like core national security issues, the supply chains for the military need to either be in allied countries or at home. I think that's perfectly reasonable. I don't think, the approach that you get with like Green New Deal style approaches to these kind of things with all the Keynesian multipliers, and we know which industries are going to be the winners and which are going to be losers. I think that's all bullshit to one extent or another. And
Right.
having two parties believe in it, I think, is disastrous.
Right. Yeah, no, I certainly hear you on the Green New Deal type stuff, which has really dominated to some extent, this version of American industrial policy, which is, not optimizing from my perspective. I mean, just because you're doing industrial policy or whatever you want to call it, and you're willing to spend some money on it, doesn't mean you're doing it right. On the other hand, even if you're not doing it right, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no role for industrial policy. So I hate to be wishy-washy about this, but I'm still an industrial policy guy, but I do think, it needs to be done right and efficiently, and it needs to be twinned with, the kind of stuff that Republicans have talked about forever, regulatory and permitting reform. It's just insane that all this money is being thrown at stuff, and it's clearly, not much is happening in some respects. It's a lot of it's being, sort of held up by various bottlenecks. I mean, it's, we've lost the ability to build stuff efficiently and fast, and to me, that's like a huge deal, and that's kind of consistent with the kind of critique conservatives have made of some liberal programs for a long time.
I mean, and this is a very liberal patriot point that I completely agree with, which is that I'm perfectly happy to stipulate that there's a role for government and all sorts of things that don't make me happy and that are inconsistent with the economic vision that I've got, right? And particularly at the state and local level and all these kinds of things. But, my colleague Kevin Williamson is the guy who basically persuaded me that I should stop thinking that bureaucrats are necessarily ipso facto bad, because every modern state is going to need bureaucrats, and good bureaucracies are much better than bad bureaucracies for all the right reasons, and that you need like Switzerland has good bureaucracies, and and those good bureaucrats are good at helping businesses get started and maintaining honest, business practices and all that kind of stuff, which all has a role. That's all fine. I think that I would have so much. There's a great line from Nat Glazer. I think it's from the early 80s, but it might have been maybe mid 70s, where he's talking about how, the Democrats are people, and Nat Glazer, never became a conservative or a Republican. He said, we used to know how to run government really well and do the things that government is supposed to do in cities. And we gave up on that. We turned our backs on that. There's a gross paraphrase, to do all of these crazy, ambitious things that we don't know how to do.
Yes, yes.
And I think that...
Excellent. Well said.
I could listen to Roy Teixeira and your top 10, your dream team of policy experts all day long about ambitious things to do if first you guys ran the schools well, right? And handled crime well, and collected garbage, and allowed businesses to form in something less than 350 days or whatever in some of these cities. And the party of government is obliged in a way to run government better than the party that doesn't like government. And the lack of faith and trust that the Democrats have brought upon themselves by talking about fundamentally transforming America rather than getting bridges built on time, right? Like, you go back and you look at how it took, 18 months, something like that, to build the Pentagon. It took, these crazy short number of days to build all of these American, look at how long it took to build the Hoover Dam. It would take you 50 years to build the Hoover Dam today.
That,
I mean, the Big Dig took 22 years.
I know.
If the Democrats want to be the party of government and do big things, there's all sorts of conservative free market-ish streamlining a government-ish things that you need to do to be able to do the big things that you want to do and prove that you have the competence. And it's like the Democrats would rather be on the side of lofty ideals and rhetoric, but not actually running things well. And I think that's what's gotten a lot of them in trouble.
Yeah, that's very fair. I agree with all of that. I think that's fundamental. Kind of to switch to the Democratic Party then for a second, how on earth did this happen? I mean, right? It's like Democrats used to know how to build stuff. I mean, is it fundamental? Are they finally being hoisted by their own petard of their sort of not really fit for purpose ideology? Just too much faith in their ability of experts to get things done, too much faith in the ability of government to get things done and not pay attention to these other factors. What went wrong? I mean, something went right for a while, and now it seems like something was gone wrong in terms of the Democrats and their ability to do things, and even their coalition, right? Is this really their ideology coming home to roost, or what are the factors you see as crucial?
And we should just stipulate that this is a little, intellectually, this is a little bit bringing coals to Newcastle insofar as like you have a well-developed view about these things, and so do your colleagues at the Liberal Patriot. But I think, again, kind of overdetermined, but I think the emphasis on the switch to identity politics from nuts and bolts, economic class stuff. I didn't like the class stuff, but the class stuff made a lot more sense just as a numbers game, and also being focused on class expands your political horizons. Where you see, people forget. I know you're not a Marxist, and I know not everybody who's a Marxist, everyone who believes in focusing on class.
Yeah, but I used to be a Marxist, so I'm fluent. I'm fluent.
But on that spectrum, there's a point to be made about Marxism, which is that Marxism is a globalist point of view, which says, workers of the world unite, right? It expands your horizons to different kinds of people, different cultures, different regions, that kind of thing. The intersectionality stuff is so identitarian that it constrains your point of view and lends to a demonization that I think is more problematic than the demonization that you get with a class focused thing. I don't like the demonization that can come with the class stuff, but that runs against the grain of American culture in a way that it keeps it in moderation. And so I think that and I think that switch happens because of what's the phrase? Elite overproduction at universities. And
I'm fascinated with that aspect. The more I think about, the more I live in this world, the more I'm convinced that has something to do with it.
Yeah, my dad was a newspaper editor. He ran newspaper syndicates and that kind of thing, and had probably at the height of his career on the journalism side, a couple thousand reporters, stringers, freelancers in his network. A huge number of them never went to college. And there was no expectation that being in journalism was necessarily something you needed to go to college for, and certainly not graduate school. In fact, I think graduate school, getting a journalism master's it's only smart because of the guild effect of places like the Columbia Journalism School, which have to justify their existence by getting jobs for people who have their degree. But I don't think I think it actually in many ways makes you a worse journalist culturally, and the way in which that sort of pipeline of universities which teach this, oppressed, oppressor narrative stuff, that teach that saturate kids with a lot of identitarian stuff, and the way that funneled into a lot of elite journalistic media institutions, Hollywood, and all the rest. I think that's a big part of the Democratic Party's problem. Again, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, in my view, a lot of their problems stem from the same American problems, right? The big sort, the failure of Congress to do its job. If Congress were still functioning properly, I think a lot of the problems that we see would not be as manifest, because I believe that Congress as an institution, is designed to be like a sponge for politics, and or maybe how wetlands work in an ecosystem where they filter out toxins before they make it to the sea, and they provide that's what Congress is supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be all the tributaries in American politics feed into it, and then you get people in a process of discovery, hashing out their differences, regional, class, race, whatever. And when Congress stops working like that, those toxins start backing up into our political system and coming up in people's septic tanks and coming up in people's backyards. And so I think the Democratic Party, it suffers from that because it is so concentrated in big cities.
Right.
Machine politics run those places. If I could have my druthers, I would just simply have every place where one party, I don't care which party, ran a location for more than 20 years, thrown out of office, and the other party come in. I think that competitive elections would do wonders for this country, and that's a big source of the big sort problem that comes with the big sort is one party rule is always unhealthy. Say what you will about Rudy Giuliani before the fall, right? I mean, contemporary Rudy Giuliani is a tragedy, but one of the things that made his mayoralty, and I grew up in New York City in the 70s and 80s, one of the things that made his mayoralty so successful was simply having an administration in there that didn't have to bribe the same, and featherbed and mollycoddle all of the same constituencies. It had a different Rolodex. It had different obligations. They tried to get the mob out of the Fulton Fish Market for like 120 years. And they never could do it because some party boss would always notify them and tell them whatever. And just because they had fresh blood in there, they could do it in a weekend. And those kinds of things, I think, are incredibly valuable. And they're nuts and bolts American politics stuff. And they would do wonders for making the parties more receptive to what voters actually want. I think the problem is we have two parties that have convinced themselves that what plays well on MSNBC or on Fox News is what the people want. And it turns out, no, that's what a fraction of the people who show up and vote in primaries want. And those people suck. I mean, I don't mean as individuals. A lot of them are wonderful people. But the people who control the primary system, and I hate the primary system.
Yeah, I know that's one of your particular bugaboos.
They vote against the other party more than they vote for their own party. And that's another reason why we're in the mess that they're in. And so the Democratic Party, because it controls the commanding heights of our culture, it gets in a populist age when you don't like any major institution, and it turns out almost all of the major institutions, particularly the ones that wag their fingers and scold you, from liberal foundations to Hollywood to the publishing industry to mainstream media, blah, 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 you're going to be even more in for a rough time. And the problem with that is that the response in this age of polarization is to double down. And so Democrats don't want to hear that they need to run more Joe Manchins and fewer, Elon Omars or AOCs if they want to be a competitive party.
Yeah, in an odd sort of way. I mean, the problem for the Democrats is they won, so they can't win. I mean, they won the battle for the control of the culture,
right?
And most of the big cities, right? They're dominant. I mean, they have complete hegemony. And because they won and they have no competition, they can't think expansively enough to figure out how to actually win in a big and broad sense.
So there's an interesting intellectual story that I think people don't give enough credence to or pay enough attention to. The story of conservative intellectuals is basically the story of intellectual refugees. Right. And in the 1960s, in particular, Cornell, Guns on Campus crisis, the Berkeley stuff, you can go down a long list. Conservative intellectuals were basically chased out of a lot of these elite institutions. And that was bad for the elite institutions because that made them go farther left. They started to declare war because these institutions have an autoimmune disease, so they start attacking healthy organs too, and they start going after center left type people thinking they're the right wingers. I mean, you look at what happened to poor Clinton Rossiter and that kind of thing. And so you have this thing where it was bad for those universities. The intellectual refugees, where do they go? They go to think tanks. Now, I've been more or less involved with AEI in one way or the other since the early 1990s. I cannot tell you how many young PhDs I've met who just wanted to teach, but they couldn't, because they were verboten at any good school. So they went the think tank route. Think tanks became very influential. They became very successful. All of a sudden, in the 2000s, places like the Center for American Progress and all these other places start springing up because they concluded, the reason Republicans are successful is because they have these really powerful think tanks.
Yeah, I remember that.
The reality is that the reason they have these think tanks is because they were chased out of the institutions they wanted to be part of. The similar phenomenon happened with Fox News. Fox News is successful in part because there's a huge market for it. And what the liberal response to Fox News in the early 2000s was to launch liberal versions of Fox News or liberal versions of right-wing talk radio.
Yes,
and,
I remember that too.
And the problem is that because in part, I think it's partly this material infrastructure focused thinking that you get on people of the left is they cannot grok that maybe the problem with their dog food is it doesn't taste good. It's got to be, oh no, we got to put it in a better bowl or in a better bag, right?
Yeah. We need to change the labeling of the can.
You find this over and over again where the one thing that can't be wrong are the actual ideas. That's where you get the George Lakoff bullshit, right? Whereas if we just call trial
think
lawyers...
about an elephant. I always thought that was complete bullshit. I mean, this is the kind of stuff people would roll into cap and tell people about, and everybody's sitting there nodding, and I'm thinking, are you kidding me? This is complete nonsense. This isn't going to do anything. But
I mean, I think that the inability of the left to really revisit its priors and think seriously about why it is not a majority party is the reason why it's not a majority party.
Yes.
I think the problem for Republicans about why they're not a majority party is they think they are a majority party, and they're not. And so they talk about ways as if everybody agrees with them, and it turns off a lot of people. I mean, Donald Trump thinks that, I used to say this all the time when he was still on, originally on Twitter, is he always thinks he has to placate his base. But the base is, by definition, the people who are with him no matter what.
Right.
But he seems to think, no, I got to keep doing this. And it always reminded me of the salesman who thinks, sure, I lose money on every sale, but I'll make up for it in volume, right? He turns off more people than he attracts, but he thinks that this country is 80% pro-Trump people. He said as much. And so they operate in that way, and it turns off a lot of people. The Democrats, I think, have an easier time, but they have to have the intellectual humility to understand the mess that they're in. And I don't see, the Liberal Patriot is a great sign that there are green shoots, but and the fact that Kamala Harris is at least through spokespeople talking about how she's a moderate. We'll see how she does in the debate.
Right.
Right.
But let me quote you something from you, Jonah, that really resonated with me in your linker conversation, and maybe a good way to close out here. You said, I've lost my appetite for caring whether something is good for the GOP. I don't mean I don't find it interesting as a pundit. Analyzing that stuff is part of my job description. I just don't feel that team spirit very much anymore. To be sure, I still root for the people I consider to be the good guys in the GOP, but I don't see every win for the GOP as a win for my team anymore. And I thought that was just very well expressed and captures some of my feelings these days about the Democrats as well. I mean, we have these two teams, which everybody is rooting for so hard, the real partisan people. And, folks like us who, they're just, I just remember for the longest time, it was just any Democrat anywhere, if they're winning, I feel great. And I just don't feel that way anymore. I mean, I'm sort of trying to look at it in a broader perspective, play a longer game. And that's what interests me, not, sort of in a micro sense, how is this Democrat going to win? We're not campaign consultants, for Christ's sake. We're trying to think about, the way the world works and what would be best for the country. And I think that takes you away from being, quite so partisan. In a way, I've found it quite liberating. Maybe it's been the same way for you.
Yeah, no, it has definitely been liberating. And sometimes I feel like the ants screaming freedom, horrible freedom in The Simpsons, because there's a certain comfort in being part of a team, right? And being part of a larger tribe. And
it's natural.
But and I want to be really clear. I'm not disparaging anybody here, because I once did the same thing, and there's a role for it in American politics. But I listen to my friends and they're sincerely my friends, and they're brilliant and honorable people, and I'm not trying to disparage them. But I listen to my friends on, say, the Commentary podcast, and John Podorza is one of my closest friends, or I listen to my friends at National Review, where it's people I've worked with for 2 decades. And now that I'm attuned to it, I'll hear them say things like, we have a good chance of picking up this many seats, or we can really pull this out if we do this, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't feel the we thing anymore when it comes to Republican electoral politics. And unlike a lot of people in my sort of anti-Trump, never Trump, whatever label you want to put on it, world, I don't feel that way about Democrats either. And I think that one of the problems that the Republican Party got in, that the conservative intellectuals got themselves into, was simply thinking that what is good for Republicans is good for conservatives, and particularly on an election cycle. And what is good for Democrats is good for liberals. And I don't think that's true. If the point of conservatism, it's like the question I asked you earlier about, are you welcoming Republicans getting into sort of more industrial policy kind of stuff? You gave the right answer from your priors, which is that you want to move the country in a specific direction. And so therefore you welcome when people agree with you, at least in part, about certain things.
Yes.
I want to move the country. I want to move this. I think the point of the conservative movement, rightly understood, is to move the center of gravity in a conservative direction. And that means sometimes a victory for conservative Democrats would be a bigger win for the long-term goals than the win of some populist Republican. And and the reason I've become more and more a think tank guy. My intellectual roots are with AEI, and AEI, often criticized for it, does not historically get that invested in the election cycle. And it thinks about long-term arguments like, what is good for free markets, for limited government, for national security. And if a Democrat is a pro-national security Democrat, well, it's better as a matter of portfolio management to have those people in both parties than in just one. And so I just don't care about the team aspect. And I've always hated popular frontism, but I usually thought of it as a thing of the left. I think popular frontism is popular frontism is just a antiquated term for tribalism in a lot of ways. And no enemies to my right is the same thing as my team no matter what. And I think that sort of thinking is one of the reasons why we're in the mess that we're in.
Yeah, I hear that, brother. That's very well expressed, and I think that's a great note upon which to end this very fine podcast. So, Jonah, I want to thank you for being on the Liberal Patriot. And it's always great talking to you, and I look forward to the next time.
Thanks very much, and I hope to have you on the Remnant again soon. And I'll turn the tables on you, and you can filibuster, and I'll just sit there.
Absolutely.